Presented, as always, by First Commonwealth Bank here on WCCS AM 1160 and FM 101.1. And he is the Statehouse Majority Leader, Dave Reed, joining us from not in the studio, but on the telephone. Good morning.
Good morning, Todd.
This is certainly a very busy time for you and for your colleagues in the State House. All of the pressure and all of the spotlight is on the State House with this budget. The governor is saying that September 15th is a deadline before he has to start cutting state services. There are a lot of people that are throwing their slings and arrows at the guys in the State House saying, you guys need to bend a little bit. What's your impression of where the budget negotiations stand right now?
Well, I think there are a couple different options out there, and hopefully those options will come to a head next week. I think next week's going to be a very, very busy week for the State House, and really for the State Senate and the governor as well, because although folks have focused on the House, I mean, obviously this is a five-party negotiation between the two caucuses in each chamber and the governor. And it began back in April when we actually were the first ones to pass a budget and pass a revenue package as well. And, the Senate took the next step when they passed the gross receipts tax and the severance tax back at the end of July. And, obviously there's been some concerns in the House on those proposals, particularly the gross receipts tax on electricity, on natural gas, and on, landline telephone. So, we've been looking at the possible alternatives that are out there, and, I think next week is going to be one of those weeks where things have to come to a head and, we pick a direction.
The taxpayer plan that was put out earlier, the taxpayer's budget, they called it, Representative Dush, one of the 18 lawmakers who signed on to that. People then, after a plan comes out like that, people start to examine the numbers and scrutinize what's going on within that particular plan. What's your impression of what they put forth, and is it something that is feasible?
I think the group did an awful lot of work at looking at the different accounts that are out there. And, there's no doubt that there's some revenue in some of these accounts that's been sitting there for a number of years that could perhaps be pushed over to the general fund to help take care of the one-year deficit that's left over from 16-17. Now, whether all that product is usable or not, the only way you find that out is a little bit of transparency out there in public purview so folks can actually evaluate it. But I think any dollar that we could take away from, the taxing or the borrowing of the Senate proposal is probably a step in the right direction. Whether the whole plan can be used or not legally, constitutionally, that's still under evaluation. But that's one of those things that's going to have to be evaluated and come to a head next week as well.
Take us inside the negotiations a little bit. When the House puts together whatever revenue package they eventually end up with, are you in constant consultation with the governor's office, with the Senate, in order to say, okay, this is what we think we can do, and then find out from them, no, we're not going to let you do that? But how does that whole process work?
It's an interesting process. That is probably the way the process should work. Doesn't necessarily work that way. We haven't actually had the opportunity to meet with the governor for several months. He has not been engaged in the negotiations. Certainly we've been talking to his office, and, the only direct communication I've had is I actually ran into him on Ag Progress Days. But his chief of staff has generally been, the chief negotiator for the administration. We've been in, pretty consistent contact with the governor's chief of staff. I've been talking to the House Democratic leadership team as well. And then, certainly, once we have a final direction and product in the House, we'll talk to the Senate to see if that is something that can be acceptable for them. But there's a lot of, I guess you could deem it shuttle diplomacy, or going back and forth with spreadsheets and numbers and proposals and, tweaks to this proposal or that proposal. Negotiating, anything that's around a $32 billion budget level is certainly not, a clean process from the perspective of, there are a lot of moving parts to it.
State Representative Dave Reed, the House Majority Leader, is with us this morning here in Indiana in the Morning. Are you hearing from other members of the Majority Caucus that they are feeling pressure from constituents or from others and they need to really move on this? Or are they feeling as if they have to make some sort of decision quickly or else it could cost them?
I think different members view it differently. There's certainly some members out there who would just as soon never do anything. on completing a budget process and let the chips fall as they may. I think there are other folks out there who look at it from the perspective of, look, we finished the spending side of the proposal. There's a responsibility to finish the other half of the proposal. And there are some real-world ramifications about to come into play for Pennsylvania when you talk about bond ratings and, cash flow issues with the general fund having enough cash flow to actually send out the dollars to human service programs and school districts, the next couple weeks and the next couple months. So I think it depends on, your view of the world, what direction folks want to head. I don't think there's any great, public outcry right now that, hey, you've got to do it today. And look, that's largely because the spending plan was passed back in June. School districts have received their dollars. Human services have received those dollars. So folks, at least up until this point, government has continued to operate as is.
He's Statehouse Majority Leader Dave Reed. We're talking about the state budget. Of course, that plays so much of a role in what else the legislature is able to do. That's really the starting point when you consider other issues such as pension reform, such as property taxes, and there's a little bit of movement on the property tax front. Is it really that type of a domino effect? Once the budget is in place, then you can move on to those other things because the budget is going to impact those discussions?
I think the budget is the singular most important issue the legislature and the governor, for that matter, deals with every single year. It's the chief responsibility until that process is complete. It is tough. It's difficult to move on to other issues that a lot of folks, including myself, care about a great deal, whether that be, restructuring our tax system, whether that be property tax elimination, just a host of issues that are out there that really do need more attention and to be able to move forward. When you've got the budget still hanging, over the state's head, you've got to complete that process before you can really get onto those issues. And a lot of those issues can have an impact on the budget long term. Welfare reform, correctional reform, the pension reform bill that we passed and got signed into law back in June. And then, looking at our debt load overall from a state's perspective, when you put those four issues together, that's really driving our budget increases every year anyway. So the quicker we can get on to dealing with some of those and actually putting some of those reforms in place, hopefully the budgetary decisions can become easier in the future.
Well, it's certainly something that people continue to watch and monitor and wonder, when the dominoes do fall, what do you move on to next? If it was the perfect world and everything was taken care of and you didn't have to concern yourself with this right now, what would be your first or one or two priorities for the coming fall session?
Well, I think a lot of that's going to depend on, the path of Hurricane Irma, whether that ends up coming into Pennsylvania as well, here next week after it hits the coast and Florida. So you never can tell with natural disasters that might be out there. But I think if I had to choose in my perfect world, it would be those two items I mentioned, property tax elimination, which we still got that proposal, House Bill 76 or Senate Bill 76 over in the Senate that's awaiting consideration before it can come over to the House. And I think just the restructuring of our tax system overall, as it relates to job creators and workers, I think that's a system that was put into place decades ago that perhaps needs reevaluated at the state level.
From a transportation standpoint, we've seen so much construction in our area, and certainly people applaud that in the last 3 or 4 years. It's just been tremendous all around Indiana County. But there are great concerns about maintaining roads and bridges when gas consumption is not what it was, and therefore gas tax collections are not what they were. As the technology continues to improve and as other fuel alternatives come into being and revenues from gas taxes at the pump continue to go down, what is the solution when it comes to funding transportation projects like roads and bridges?
Well, I think that is something that is certainly going to have to be on the forefront of the discussion over the next 5, 10, 20 years. Because you're right. I mean, and just look at the past 20 years, gas consumption has gone down dramatically. Cars are more fuel efficient, but they're the same size, if not bigger, doing just as much, if not more damage to the roads. And it costs a tremendous amount to upkeep those roads and the bridges that are associated with them. So, I think we're probably going to have to not just look at, what revenue sources are more appropriate than a gas tax, perhaps, changing that mechanism. But also, in a lot of areas in some states, public-private partnerships have worked out very, very well, where you get, private dollars into those equations and matching them with public dollars. And you can, produce, particularly among the major highway systems, products that are in better condition than some of the roads and bridges that we have here today. But you're right, in Indiana County, we've been very blessed. We've had a lot of upkeep and upgrades over the last couple of years since the transportation funding package was put into place. Got a lot of construction down there in Center Township and Homer City right now, changing some of these bridges, that were basically falling apart from underneath. You don't see it when you drive over top, but you look underneath, and all of a sudden everything's rusted out, cement's gone, and there's wood where steel beams used to be. So I think, that upgrade is necessary and unfortunately not cheap, but I think long term it's definitely a discussion folks are going to have in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I think so as well. And in fact, the idea of consumption taxes are really going to be a part of that discussion, I think, with transportation funding. Although I don't know how you do that when someone might drive 40 miles in a day, but, in for instance, my case, a good 10 miles of them happen to be on dirt roads and then township roads, and then you get onto a state road, and figuring out that in terms of how much mileage you're driving and on what quality of the roads would just certainly be a tremendous headache. But certainly that will be a part of the entire conversation. You do have a couple of more public hearings coming up, or public meetings, don't you?
Yeah, we've got a couple of town halls. We just had our one in Homer City about a week and a half ago. But we've got our Blairsville Town Hall coming up on October 5th. We've got our Senior Expo that we co-host with Senator Don White in Indiana at the ice rink on October 12th. October 19th, we've got our town hall down in Armagh. And then on November 2nd, we've got the Clymer Town Hall at the Volunteer Fire Department up there in Clymer. So we've got 3 town halls and a Senior Expo coming up over the next month and a half.
That'll keep you busy. You better get that budget resolved in time to get back here for those town halls.
Yeah, it's always an awkward town hall if you don't show up at it. So hopefully this thing gets resolved, very, very soon here, and we can move on to other issues.
All right. We appreciate your time here this morning. Back to work now.
Thanks, Todd. Have a good day.
You too. We'll see you. There's